In the beginning, there was nothing.
So what's your podcast about?
Oh, it's about psychology, true crime, supernatural stuff, the occasional paranormal or philosophical rant.
Well, maybe I could check it out sometime.
The terrible thing about searching for the truth is that sometimes you find it. Sometimes you find it.
The breath of the Creator fluttered against the face of the void, whispering, "Let there be light." And light was. And it was good.
What is it in us that seeks the truth? Is it our mind? Or is it our heart?
So Grasshopper walks into a bar, and then the bartender's like, "We have a drink named after you." And then the Grasshopper's like, "You have a drink named Steve?"
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural.
There is this strange temptation that appears whenever Christians begin talking about the origin of existence. We feel as though we must know. We must know exactly how old the earth is. We must know exactly how Genesis corresponds to geology. We must know exactly where Adam stands in relation to the history of human biology. We must know whether every stage of evolutionary theory is correct, partly correct, or destined to be replaced. Somewhere along the way, a question that ought to produce wonder begins producing anxiety. The mystery of creation begins to feel like a threat to salvation. Perhaps one of the first virtues required in a discussion about creation is humility. This is not the same thing as intellectual surrender. Christianity does not ask us to shrug our shoulders and say, "Science does not matter." Catholicism in particular has never been comfortable with the idea that faith requires us to fear reason. The Catechism speaks positively of scientific studies that have enlarged our knowledge of the age and dimensions of the cosmos and development of life, saying that such discovery should lead to greater admiration of the Creator. The Church is not frightened by a telescope, a fossil, a genome, or a geological layer. Truth cannot finally contradict truth because whatever is true has the same ultimate author. Yet humility means recognizing the kinds of truth we are dealing with. Science is extraordinarily powerful because it studies the measurable structures and processes of the created world. It asks questions like, what happened? In what sequence? By what mechanism? Under what conditions? Theology asks questions science, by its method, cannot answer. Why is there something rather than nothing? Why is nature intelligible? What is a human person? What is goodness? What is the purpose of creation? Those are not competing sets of questions, but they do overlap in some areas. This is particularly important with evolution. A Catholic does not have to choose between saying God created and saying that living things develop through natural processes over immense periods of time. That opposition assumes that if God acts, nature cannot act. Or if nature acts, God must be absent. Classical Christian theology has never understood divine causality this way. God is not simply one more cause inside the universe, standing beside gravity, chemistry, mutation, natural selection. He is the reason anything exists and possesses causal power in the first place. In the language of the tradition, God ordinarily governs creation through secondary causes, a process does not become godless merely because it's a process. Pius XII, therefore, permitted serious discussion of evolution concerning the origin of the human body, while insisting that the spiritual soul is immediately created by God. Decades later, St. John Paul II observed that converging discoveries had made evolution more than a hypothesis. At the same time, Catholicism cannot simply baptize philosophical materialism. The statement that populations of organisms change over generations is one kind of statement. The statement that matter is all that exists, that human consciousness is only chemistry, that morality is an evolutionary illusion, or that purpose is imaginary, is something else entirely. Those conclusions do not come out of a fossil bed or a DNA sequencer. They are philosophical interpretations placed upon scientific data. The Catholic can accept mechanism without accepting metaphysical reductionism. Imagine that tomorrow some discovery forced scientists to revise the estimated age of Earth substantially. Christianity would not collapse. Christ would still have been crucified under Pontius Pilate. The tomb still would be empty. The apostles would have proclaimed the resurrection. Baptism would still unite us to Christ. Sin would still require redemption. Grace would still be grace. Death would still be an enemy that Christ has conquered. Now reverse it. Imagine that some extraordinary discovery supported a much younger creation than contemporary geology allows. The gospel would not become more true. Christ would not become more risen. The sacraments would not require additional grace. The command to love God and neighbor would not become more binding. Our hope of resurrection would not grow stronger by a single degree. That is because the age of the earth is not the object of Christian faith. Salvation is, and there's a difference. Salvation history depends upon God truly acting in history, not upon our possessing a complete chronology of everything that happened before human history. Christian faith makes historical claims that cannot retreat into a vague world of symbols whenever evidence becomes uncomfortable. There was a real creation. There was a real human fall. Abraham belongs to the history of God's covenantal purposes. Israel is real. Jesus of Nazareth entered history, suffered, died, and rose from the dead. Christianity stands or falls with realities like these, but not whether the material earth existed for thousands, millions, or billions of years before the human drama unfolded. None of that changes the structure of that story. Nor does it give us a clock for the return of the Messiah. Jesus explicitly refuses that kind of timetable. On that day and hour, no one knows. Christians should be among the people most capable of living in the tension between science and faith, because our tradition teaches that faith and reason belong together. We can listen seriously to scientists without asking them to become theologians. We can listen seriously to Scripture without reducing inspired revelation to a laboratory report. There may be even something spiritually healthy in not knowing everything about our beginning. It reminds us that we are creatures, that we entered the story already underway. We have perhaps 80 years, perhaps fewer, perhaps a little more to look around this astonishing place and decide what we will do with the life we have received. When we stand before Christ, I doubt the decisive question will be whether we correctly estimated the age of a zircon crystal or reconstructed the precise biological history of the human body. The decisive question will concern what we did with the truth actually entrusted to us. Did we love God? Did we love our neighbor? Did we repent? Did we receive grace? Did we become holy? Study creation, debate it, follow the evidence wherever it honestly leads, ask the difficult questions without fear, refuse both fundamentalist panic and scientific arrogance. Let the mystery remain mysterious. Because the Christian hope has never depended upon knowing exactly how long the world has been here. It depends on knowing who made it, who entered it, who redeemed it, and who is coming again.
Today we step into the most profound crossroads of science, faith, and human understanding. From the origins of creation to the fierce debate surrounding evolution, old Earth, and young Earth perspectives. We enter a world where data, doctrine, and discovery often collide. But beyond the noise lies a deeper pursuit of truth. How do everyday people navigate these complex possibilities without losing wonder, reason, or belief? Guided by the mind of a scientist devoted to bridging rigorous inquiry with accessible understanding, we explore the vast terrain where evidence meets meaning and where questions about our beginnings still shape the future of humanity. She is the scientific storyteller, the evidence explorer, and empirical evangelist, Dr. Stacy. Welcome to Truth and Shadow Podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me on, Brendan.
So as we begin, if you can tell the audience where they can find you and what kind of resources you have available to them.
Sure, yes. I used to pay for a website, but I have since joined the masses and switched over to Substack. So I have a Substack called God and Element. And I have information there about my speaking and books. And I have compiled all of my writing and speaking information on that Substack. I also teach for 2 Catholic institutions, higher ed at Seton Hall and Holy Apostles College and Seminary, where I'm program director for the undergraduate program. But you can find everything about me by going to God and Element, my Substack, or you can search my name on the internet and come even close spelling my last name correctly, and you'll find me.
So as we begin, I'm curious about some of your background and then where you grew into faith. I mean, I know it's a really long conversion story, so we don't need to dedicate the entire episode to just that. But I think some of the highlights are really important.
Yeah, well, I was a chemist before I was Catholic, and I was one of these people who left my childhood faith. I grew up Baptist, Texas, and I left my faith behind when I went off to college to study biology, and never looked back for almost 15 years. I studied biology. I decided to switch to chemistry because I wanted to understand what was going on underneath the biology, and fell in love with chemistry, went on to get a PhD and worked at DuPont. And it was somewhere in my 30s, very committed as a left brain logical person to this idea that everything is made of atoms. That I really struggled with relationships and how to see the other human people, including the newborn child in my arms, as something I love. I didn't understand what that meant. I didn't understand how to think of my own life and my own place in the universe, or why I loved my children so much I'd give my life for them. So I started asking bigger questions beyond science. I was forced to admit that science didn't have all the answers. And I found my way into the Catholic Church, was thrilled to read the Catechism and discover the treasure of literature in the Catholic Church that answers all the questions I had and clarifies for me what things we don't have answers for. It's been a wild ride ever since I made that decision, because I have gone on to learn about theology and philosophy and exercise my right brain a little bit. And it's just made life very interesting, because there are big questions to think about as human. And now I feel like I have the tools to do so.
That's a really interesting story. I mean, I've heard bits and pieces of that over the years of following you and things. So there's a lot. And then obviously reading your books here. One of the things I'm curious about is within chemistry and looking at things like molecular biology and the development of species over time and things like that, where we learn in everyday school about micro and macroevolution and all of these different things, and yet people of faith, and we see that God creates everything, and then you're confronted with data that shows kind of a migration or a speciation. How do we confront that? And then how do we deal with that without losing some of our sanity?
Well, it is a big question. And the first thing that I think is important for us in 2026 to realize is that we simply don't have all the pieces of the evolution puzzle to put together. There's so much we don't know because of all the reasons people talk about it. We're talking about the deep past, the deep history. We're talking about things that happened before humans were even on the earth. We're talking about how to interpret scripture, which in and of itself is not something people can agree on all the time. And so we don't have the answers. I heard someone say one time, it'll probably take another 100 years of scholarship to figure some of this out. And I thought, well, why 100 years? I mean, we may never figure some of these things out because I don't even see in 100 years how we're going to have more information than we necessarily do now. With that said, we do have genetics, and genetics is a molecular biochemistry. Fundamentally, it is atoms doing their thing. When you have the genes of a male and a female come together, or reproduction any other way. So we do have a basis for understanding reproduction and change. And I was just actually reading Darwin on the Origin of Species yesterday because I teach a graduate level Catholic course on evolution and Catholic thought, and I start out having the students read the first chapter of that book because Darwin's big question was species. At the time in the Aristotelian milieu, the understanding was that God created a fixed number of species and that everything evolved from there. But within those species, there were forms of things. And Darwin is honestly, quite brilliantly saying we don't see this. So when we look at domestication and how humans have domesticated animals, pigeons, dogs, horses over the years, plants, the food we eat. He says we intentionally reproduce for certain traits, and we've seen how much things can change. And so what is the reason for believing there were a fixed number of species and everything just varied within that lane? Like he says, there's no empirical basis for believing that. So he sees it more as a continuum, and we defined what the species are based on what can reproduce with what, based on our own definition. So he's asking a good question. And what is the answer? We don't have the answer.
Because Darwin was like, well, nature does not make jumps. It's something he was dealing with. Yeah, you're right. Was that Aristotle's? Did you say scale of life? I think that's what that was called.
Yeah, I mean, Aristotelian metaphysics holds that there is matter and form, and I do subscribe to the Thomistic version of Aristotelian metaphysics. That a cat is the form of a cat, and it's matter that is in the form of a cat, and the form comes from the existence that's granted by God. But there's nothing theologically that says God had to create certain species, and animals and plants can only evolve within those lanes. So I don't subscribe to that either. And it's not just because I was a chemist before I became Catholic. I just know that the church is open to us exploring evolution. The church says you can make whatever scientific conclusion makes most sense to you. So young earth creationists are allowed, they're not contradicting the church to have that position scientifically. So I encourage my students and anybody I talk to just remain open. Like, we don't have to be in a hurry to have all the answers because we're not going to. So better to learn how to explore responsibly than to get all wadded up. We don't have all the answers right now.
With your teaching graduate level Catholic classes and stuff, that at the same time in, say, liberal colleges or mainline colleges, you have what has become coined scientism, right? Its own religion of science. And I'm kind of curious about your take on, why is that so intimidating? Why is it such an imposing or such a large imposition upon young minds entering into the upper levels of education? Because, I went to school for a trade school. Okay. I learned how to weld, and that was my trade. And so we didn't have discussions about theology and science. It did not matter one bit, because that, at the end of the day, wasn't going to bring home money for me. But yet we get a lot of college kids, they go into college, maybe they're going for a business degree. That seems to be the most common. And they are confronted with scientism's version of science. And it seems to have no bearing whatsoever on how much of a decimal point they have to watch out for when they're paying their employees.
Mm-hmm. It's part of the time we live in. So one thing I hated in high school was history, but I've come to appreciate it as a Catholic now. Because Catholic means universal, and we are encouraged. Every time we go to Mass, we are connecting with antiquity. We are connecting with all across the globe, all the other Masses that are being prayed that day, and we're also connecting with the past, and with the future, you could say. But you learn to think bigger, and so that. Reading encyclicals, trying to understand what was going on at the time, reading the church fathers, trying to understand what the apostles were dealing with, trying to understand Aristotle and why Aquinas adopted Aristotle and brought it into Catholic theology. It forced me to realize that people are trying to answer the questions of their time. Okay, why am I saying that? Because we are too. We are answering the questions of our time, and we happen to live in a time when not even 100 years ago, quantum physics and chemistry were understood like they are today. We didn't have mobile devices 100 years ago. We didn't have computers like we have now 100 years ago. We didn't have podcasts like we're doing now. We didn't have the ability to do any of that. We are literally living in the midst of a radical revolution in technology. And so a lot of students, when what do we want when we're young and we're growing up and we're starting to look around the world and wonder what our place is? We want certainty. And so science offers that certainty. So it seems to students. But when you get into the higher level of science, you realize it doesn't have the certainty either. And that there, as you mature, you start to look at what can I be certain of? And that's what philosophers for all time have thought about.
Yeah, something that I had thought was really interesting, because I read quite a bit, Thomas Aquinas, of course, but I've also looked at a lot of stuff by like Bonaventure or Pseudo-Dionysius and St. Augustine, for example, are all Neoplatonists. So it's kind of an interesting observation to look at these two different views, the Platonic view or the Aristotelian view when it comes to metaphysics, and see how they are different, and how I think both have eventually led to people wanting to really have a more empirical view of the world. But empiricism itself seems to have kind of its own issue with how we know things. Can you talk about that for a second?
Yeah, and that we take that for granted, because we do. We start out as babies and we look at our people and we look at faces, and then we look at an apple and we see a bunch of apples and we learn that is an apple. Then we learn there are green apples, there are yellow apples. We go through life learning to name things and express what's in our mind. And that's what we do with science. So one thing, I hope I'm answering your question. One thing I always tell my students, and I feel like this inoculates you, like it makes you immune to the confusion about science and faith, is that science is the study of the handiwork of God. So if you are a scientist, you are studying what God created. And that way, if you start out by looking at things that way, you're not asking whether science is proving God exists or not. You're understanding that to even be able to do science requires that you believe there is an intelligible world, and that you are intelligent and able to receive data through your eyeballs and your nose and your ears and your mouth and your fingers, and process it and make sense of it. So if that weren't true, we couldn't even do science. So that when we look then at the data for evolution, you always are going to be, if you're looking at the fossil record, you're looking at mere fragments of puzzle pieces of the bigger picture. You're looking at what we can find in the ground that was left behind from animals long ago dead. And then we have radiometric dating. And then we have genetics, which I think is one of the strongest arguments for evolution. And we have what we know, but even all of the fanciest science we have right now is incapable of telling us exactly all the chemical reactions that are happening in your body this minute for your heart to take one more beat. Like all the electronic and the chemical and the biological proteins and the gases and the equilibriums, all that has to happen just for your heart to beat one more time. We take it for granted. But there is no scientist and no collection of scientists that can write all that down. And just in the time it took me to say all that, your heart beat, like 10 or 12 times. So we're not able to know that much. So it's perfectly reasonable in evolution for the biological evolutionary scientists to find what they can, propose their theories, try to make sense of it. And at no point are we ever going to be able to say, eureka, we just figured out exactly how God created the diversity of life on Earth for all time. We're just not going to be able to do that.
And I think part of that is learning the science, learning what dating an item actually means, as opposed to going off of, straw men or whatever. It's kind of like, I've been a Catholic 14 years, and I, like you had said, you started reading the catechism. That's what I started with. I read the catechism because people were telling me, oh, the Catholic Church believes this, that, and the other thing. I says, you know what? I always believe a person should defend themselves, and so I will read what they put together, and I will actually, I read both the Council of Trent catechism and the John Paul II's before I was even Catholic. So I understand very importantly that there's a need for people to go, okay, this is what carbon dating is. This is what radiometric dating is. This is what it means when I use this or that or this system. And these are the results. And we know that they're plus or minus this much, but we can actually know with a level of certainty how old something is based off of these testing results. So how important can we talk about that? Can we talk about the value of learning the science before we make these hasty judgments?
Yeah, I mean, we can take from science. So let me think about how to answer that. When we take what scientists are saying, okay, scientific consensus. I think that's a word that resonates with a lot of people in this discussion. When you hear that there's a scientific consensus, that is powerful because it does mean that a lot of data from a different angles and a lot of people's opinions who are qualified to say are converging on the same conclusion. So there is something to that. There's a lot of consensus in atomic theory. There's a lot of consensus that there's a nucleus with neutrons and protons. I accept that because it makes sense. There's plenty of data backing it up. But scientific consensus is also not equal to fact. It is where we are today. There were literally physicists who wanted to end their lives when quantum physics came along because it radically changed the way they thought about things. That they said, I hope I just die. I don't want to have to rethink about. So it can always be changed. There could always be something that we understand better about evolution. I don't know what it would be, but I say this in particles of space. You have to take what is known at this point in time for what it is. Theories are called theories because they're always subject to change with more data and more experimentation and more understanding. I mean, heck, even just in philosophy, people are still working out what it means to say essence or substance. We're still working those things out. So I think it's a better way to spend your life trying to add something to the discussion like you're doing with your podcast. I think it's better to try to push along human understanding and a little bit. And it happens in a messy way because everybody's at a different place. But just contribute positively to the gain of knowledge in your lifetime. But you're going to die and the answers won't all be there. So, I mean, I know it sounds like I'm avoiding answering questions. It's just that's one thing that gets me in the evolution debate. And even in Eucharistic miracles debate, which touches on what you're saying about the shroud. Some people talk about these things with such certainty. And it's frustrating because they convince people like certainty, and they convince people that things are more certain than they are. And a lot of times people doing that, like I get really suspicious when somebody is like, I am convinced this is they'll defend that to their death. They don't know. They can't know that well. And I'm much more inclined to appreciate an openness to what's going on. That doesn't mean at some point, G.K. Chesterton said, an open mind is like an open mouth. If that's all you've got, you'll die. Because at some point you have to close your mouth and chew your food and swallow it. So I do think there are truths we arrive at that we can be certain about. That's where faith comes in. But evolutionary science, not a lot to be certain about.
It's true. It's fair enough. I mean, you're right. There's quite a bit going on from the different stuff that we have, from Ardipithecus forensis to Denisovans. And I mean, it's like, oh, we just got knuckle bones. And it's like, well, that's kind of not all that's there. But, I mean, these little things are kind of an interesting part of that conversation. And you're right about certainty. It is really simple. One example, and I'm going to talk about this with like young Earth creation. I live in the Willamette Valley, and the Willamette Valley was formed in a matter of moments when the Missoula, Montana ice wall broke during a warming event, or right around the Younger Dryas impact event, if you will. So this the Younger Pleistocene, or whatever the heck it's called. I'm going to call it the Younger Dryas. But anyways, that wall broke and it gushed billions of gallons of water instantly, water, rocks, everything, down from the Columbia River Gorge, and then separated down into what's now the Willamette Valley. And we know this because there are areas that we've... like I was part of this, where scientists and archaeologists have dug and found rocks that their genetic or their chemical line is from Montana, or we find mammoth bones or human remains that were from Montana. And so we know that this is what's going on, and that was in a matter of moments. But that's an exception and not the rule. How do we establish for people to see that this is an exception? That's not how it normally happens, and then this is kind of the greater potential. How do we bridge that gap?
Well, things happen sporadically a lot. Things can happen for various reasons. I mean, even evolution is not linear the way scientists understand it. It's not perfectly linear. There can be spurts and stable periods in response to the environment, and in response to the the genes that are being passed on. So, even I remember taking some kind of geology class in college where we had to look at the layers of rock, and it fascinated me that the ground we're standing on has so much history underneath it. Like, we don't think about what's under the dirt, but when you're driving and see, like where you live, you can see that the geological history and how there are layers that have been laid down, but you also see how the earth can get moved around. Like there can be volcanoes or even magma that push up and move where things are. So it's a story that we're trying to understand when we look at things like that. Even the weather, we don't know. The weather, people can predict when it's going to rain next. But if you were to go outside in your front yard and draw a square meter in your yard, a small space, you're incapable of predicting exactly when the next raindrop will hit in that space. Like, Like there are some things we just can't resolve down to the level of detail. You could predict it might rain tomorrow, but you don't know when a raindrop is going to hit in that space. And that gets back to the question of radiometric dating. We know that's how they determine rock's ages. We know that we can measure how much of a radioactive parent isotope has decayed into the stable daughter isotope over time because we know a constant half-life. But just because we can look at the collection of elements and know a half-life of each different element, it doesn't mean we know when each individual atom is going to decay. So there's even an average with that. But that is the basis of radiometric dating, is that we know the half-life. And if we were wrong about the half-life, then we would be wrong about radiometric dating, but we can observe it. So there's a good reason to believe radiometric dating.
Yeah, and you did something else that was interesting to me with time in human evolution, for example, because it can stop and just stay along a line for a given period of time. For example, the Clovis people, the Clovis points, they lasted for quite a long time because there was no need to develop that technology into another form for quite a while because it was just a stable environment, and this kind of point worked with their hunting and needs at the time. And, now I'm part of the Oregon Archaeology Society, and we have people now talking about pre-Clovis cultures. And 10 years ago, that would have been a reason to chase you out with pitchforks and torches. But it is kind of an interesting thing when we start looking at human evolution and understanding hominid evolution, where that comes and goes. What's kind of a good point to talk on that with individuals who may hold to one view over another with, say, not a macroevolution of humans, but, hominids, Homo sapiens sapiens living alongside Neanderthals, for example?
Yeah, that's a big one. And I even have my students take a look at that. It is shocking for them to read about it. Shocking. I mean, it's shocking because we don't want to think about, like, if we're thinking about Neanderthals living at the same time as modern humans and possibly mating, then that messes up the picture of Adam and Eve that we have in our head. We are no longer. Then we're forced to say, well, are they not human? Then we're forced to say that continuum that Darwin talks about. There might be some truth to it, and if there is, then at what point were first humans did they appear? That's a really hard one because we're human. We don't want to think about, and I hate it when people say evolution just says we're all evolved from apes. That's not even what it says. Yet at the same time, it does. If you take that theory all the way, it would hold that everything, all life, evolved from inanimate atoms that came together into certain molecules, that came together into certain polymers, that came together into certain organelles eventually, and that life eventually arose with photosynthesis providing the oxygen over the eons. So when you look at the screenplay of evolution in terms like that, you're tempted to want to say, okay, when did humans appear? When did they first appear? Now you've got the really, it's tied to the species question, but now you've made it personal. Now we're talking about us. And now we're talking about Adam and Eve. And that is where the biggest disagreement comes from. But again, we don't know everything. And so I talked to a priest, a president rector of a university where I was teaching once about Adam and Eve. Like, because there are Catholics who explore the idea of first man being a population. So it was a population that arose in the evolutionary time, and it wasn't just a single man or single woman. First man means first population man. And I was asking him about that because some Catholics do talk about that, and he said, "I'm not ready for that," and I said, "I'm not either. I don't see how that could be." And so what you're left with is then how do you reconcile the story of Adam and Eve with the story of human evolution? and all the questions involved in human. How do you reconcile it? Just the idea that there was this continuum of evolution, and at some point, the first human appeared. Because evolution doesn't even work that way. You don't have the first appearing. We know about a population, new species later on when we look back at it. We don't even think of it in terms of just one appearing, then two, then four. It doesn't work like that. All that to say, and this is what I say in Particles of Faith, it doesn't rule out a miracle. Okay, so it is a little bit of it's kind of the same cheat as saying God created fixed species. But look, he could have created fixed species. It doesn't match with the science, but it doesn't mean God didn't do that. In the same way, I think God could have created first man and woman miraculously. That could have been a supernatural act. That was a miracle. That was a break in the natural order of things. That the first humans were Adam and Eve, who God created miraculously. Now, that idea of mine, that theory, that opinion fits with everything in theology. It fits with everything in science, only because science can't rule on it either way. Science is silent there. And it's my opinion. But in theology and theological research, we're allowed to do that. We're allowed to form opinions that don't break any dogmas, that don't go outside the guardrails of the church. And where I am is, as long as we can't rule out a miraculous appearance of Adam and Eve, we shouldn't. And so when you put it like that, we're kind of done, because science can't prove they didn't exist. A miracle could explain it. And so it's like, next. There's nothing to argue about.
Yeah, let's see, just a couple of things to pick up on there. I think that's what's known as the Cambrian explosion, when it goes from inorganic to organic. And I do believe I had read a paper, or at least an article from Miller, or mentioned Miller and Urey, is that right? Who basically said it could, lightning strikes, meteor impacts, and a couple of other things could cause basically things like lipids, amino acids, and a bunch of other stuff to form and create, obviously, organic life. And I thought that was kind of interesting because, of course, God uses, he may very well have used a meteor to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah, or a volcanic eruption or something, I don't know, to destroy Sodom and Gomorrah. And so he could very well do whatever he wants to do to start life on Earth. I mean, obviously, I don't think the creator of the laws of nature is exempt to modifying them upon his own will. I mean, Jesus, for Pete's sakes, right? That violates the laws of nature. And so I think that was kind of an interesting way of talking about those things and answering that question. I appreciate that. Something else I was thinking about was basically kind of along the lines of like quantum mechanics. There's a hot debate right now that quantum mechanics may actually be explaining the way consciousness works. And I think that's an interesting debate. Are you familiar at all with that?
Well, I'm not a fan of that either. I think Penrose had some things to talk about quantum event inside the neurons that generate consciousness. So what he means by that, so fundamentally, quantum mechanics is indeterminate. And what they mean by indeterminate is the same thing I was saying about radiometric dating. We can know a half-life of a population of atoms, but we are incapable of saying when any one atom is going to decay. The ones that do undergo nuclear decay, we can't say exactly when they will. We don't know how to determine that yet. We don't know when that raindrop's going to fall in that square meter in your front yard next. We know that it will, but we don't know exactly when it will, because it's indeterminate. We don't have the skills to determine when it will happen. Now, in quantum theory, some people say we don't have the skills to determine it, but we could if we knew enough about nature's laws. But there are other people that say, no, there are no laws, that it's completely indeterminate in the sense that it's completely random. So there's two different interpretations even of the word indeterminism. Is it indeterminate in that we can't determine, or is it indeterminate in the sense that it's completely random? I tend to think the other one makes more sense, that it's indeterminate because there's a limit to our human knowledge that we may never be able to cross. And like Pope Benedict XVI once said, how could an ordered nature be fundamentally disordered? You don't get order rising disorder. And I know that you can if you put a bunch of M&Ms in a box and shake them around like there are things, but there is order there that's causing that, not complete disorder. So quantum mechanics then and consciousness is that in this indeterminism, there is freedom for things to be other than they are. And so consciousness arises in the neuron and that is our choosing, is the neuron, the atoms that make up the neurons choosing to do certain things that we can't determine. And that there's this consciousness, quantum consciousness as a result of that. I don't like that theory. I think it's fanciful. You know, my idea about Adam and Eve being miraculously created may sound fanciful, but I think it's just solid. Like it's a solid way of saying we don't know. But to say that causes consciousness, I just don't. It's too speculative for me. There isn't any way to prove it. The idea of us being body and rational soul made in the image and likeness of God with the spiritual powers of intellect and will made to practice virtue and get to heaven, that makes a lot more sense to me.
Yeah, there was something that I was reading about in archaeology. Someone was talking about there is a measurable time that people, or hominids, before a certain point did not, for example, bury their dead. That's kind of an interesting thing. There's a period of time where hominids do not bury their dead, and then when they start burying their dead, they start doing it with what would be maybe religious artifacts. So it doesn't go from not burying the dead, and then religious artifacts. It's literally not, and then burying with religious artifacts. And some had said that might have been the time where consciousness enters into the human machine. I don't know what to say, but that's kind of an interesting idea. That here it is, where we're not, hominids are not doing this thing, and then they're doing a thing with meaning. And I think that's kind of an interesting conversation.
Yeah, the burials and religious artifacts, I think they wouldn't mark the origin of consciousness because the populations would have to be conscious before they did that. But they mark the point when humans begin expressing symbolic thought, ritual behavior, abstract thinking, social meaning. So it's proof that they were doing that at that time. It still doesn't give us much indication about when they started doing it. But at that time, they were conscious enough to have that kind of abstract thought. And what they're looking for there, and I think that's what you were saying too, something that separates us from the other animals, something that shows we're having this kind of abstract thinking intellect beyond what other populations of animals would do.
Yeah, there's a direct example. Raccoons. I love raccoons. Raccoons are like my spirit animal kind of thing. Raccoons. I love raccoons. And coyotes, but coyotes for a Native American reason, raccoons for a kind of a point, because raccoons have shown remarkable levels of consciousness, problem solving that they remember and pass down to further next generations. Individualism, they show that one is me and you are you, and there's kind of this complex thing, but they're not burying their dead with religious artifacts. So obviously they don't have that same, where we are. I mean, I think someone was talking about there's some chimpanzees, a tribe of chimps or bonobos, I can't remember which, who have been burying dead recently with things. And so that was kind of weird. But anyways, it's a completely different sidetrack, really, about kind of the evolution of consciousness, I guess you can call that, the religio consciousness, not just self-awareness. But anyways, I was going to ask about dealing with people who have agreed with the young Earth creationist scientists and how they may feel. Why do they feel like if they discount that young Earth creationism, that it's somehow a disbelief in God?
Yeah, this is the thing that really gets to me, and I think sometimes people are disappointed when they listen to me talk because they think, oh, this chemist is going to completely refute young Earth creationism or completely refute the Darwinian evolution, or that I'm going to bring all this scientific explanation. It's really not. I think I already explained the science the way I see it to you in a nutshell. Like whatever evolution is, it is, and it's there for us to discover and try to understand. And certain things will never rule out a miracle, but neither should we invoke miracles like a God of the gap argument. It's just both can be true at the same time. So what you're left with then, what I don't do, and I have on that bookshelf back there, I have some of the big, thick young Earth creationist books that were put out. And I've been criticized for not going through it and refuting everything in there. I tried one time, and I couldn't even get past the first 3 pages before I wanted to throw the thing into the fire. Like, it was so frustrating to me because so much was being said, and it wasn't rigorous. I know I'm being critical, but that was my experience. So much was being said, and I was like, hold it. Like, there were things, just assumptions being made biblically, scripturally, scientifically, and it was laying the groundwork that everything else is going to be built on, but the fundamental assumptions were just wrong. And one of those fundamental assumptions is that you aren't a good Catholic if you don't subscribe to young Earth creationism. And that is not what the church teaches. It is definitively not what the church teaches. And people have told me, well, you just don't understand what the church teaches. People who think that aren't following the real church. And as soon as you say that, we're into, division and schism. And I don't want to go there because it's not true. The church documents written by legitimate popes leave the door open for that. And at the same time, it leaves the door open for people to subscribe to the science of young Earth creationism. That's okay too. But what it comes down to is this desire for certainty. So I come at it from a psychoanalysis standpoint, and I have no skills in psychoanalysis, but I'm a mother of 7 and a grandmother of 7, so I do understand a little bit about how people think. And I've taught for many decades. So it's a desire for certainty, and the young Earth creationists sound really certain. And so that's very attractive in a confusing world. But what they're really doing is something you should not do. It is actually, I don't want to use the word heretical too lightly, but it's actually wrong to do it, is to take your opinion, which you're allowed to hold, and say it's dogma, raise it to the level of dogma that is binding on all Catholics when it's not. And so that's what the modernists did. That was the modernist crisis. They made up their own dogma and said it was binding on Catholics when it wasn't. So, I've said before, sometimes traditionalists are the new modernists, but so when there isn't that openness, I'm automatically suspicious of the person's reasons for even putting forth all the scientific arguments, because their fundamental assumption is they have to prove evolution wrong. And that assumption is itself wrong.
Right. And I was thinking about an example with that. I'm a corgi father. We have 2 corgis in the house. One is a full-bred corgi, and the other is a cowboy corgi, which is a crossbreed between corgi and blue heeler. Right, so corgi dad, blue heeler mom. So that is a great example of microevolution, speciation. And I think some individuals may not understand the difference between
micro and macro. And so that's my final question for this show is can you explain to us how it is that microevolution is and how what macroevolution is supposed to be, and where we are with that?
It is a key distinction, getting back to species, like we started talking about. But when you're talking to the scientists in evolution, there is really no such thing between microevolution and macroevolution. It's just on a different scale. So evolution scientifically is just defined as it's at the population level. So it's not, we're never talking about individuals, we're talking about evolution. It's another reason evolution can't find Adam and Eve, because they're individuals. We're talking about population. If you have a population of rabbits and 30% of them have one gene and 70% of them don't have that gene, and they reproduce, and you come back in 10 generations and you look at the new population and the percentage of that gene has changed to 50-50 or whatever, that is evolution. It's a change in the gene frequency and population over time. And so microevolution just means you're looking at a shorter time. Macroevolution is much, much longer time. So what that says is on the continuum, then you do have a species that could evolve enough times, and that's where you get the tree branching out. Things could evolve in different ways over time according to natural selection and genetic mutation, depending on the environment, that you could have completely new species arising. And we're defining species as can't breed with something from another population. So you can see how that starts to happen. And what scientists do is they're not out there, my granddaughter, they're not out there. She sees herself on the camera. They're not out there saying, oh, look, a new species just arose. They go back retrospectively and they look and say, this species, there was enough gene frequency changing that you get a population that can't even breed with another population. That's going to be a new species. They're looking at that. So that would be macroevolution. Don't do that. We're on the phone. And so it's really the same process at different scales. And it gets back to the same question about, are species fixed or are they mutable? And evolution says they're mutable.
Yeah, it reminds me a lot of I don't know if you've heard this one. Some people, when they eat cilantro, it tastes like soap. Have you heard that one? So apparently, the people who taste cilantro and it tastes like soap, they have basically a variation of what's known as the OR6A2 olfactory receptor gene. And those of us who eat cilantro and it doesn't taste like soap, we don't have that, which actually means we would technically be a different species if you were going with that kind of a weird kind of definition. And it's obviously we don't have two human species running around, those who say cilantro tastes like soap, which is an older, they have that gene still, as opposed to us who do not, which is a newer gene split. Fantastic. Hey, I want to thank you very much for coming on my show. If you can leave your information and where people can find you, that'd be great. Thank you.
Yes. Substack, Stacy, whatever the address is, Stacy Trasenkos. Let me see if I can find it.
Fantastic. No, that's great. And then Particles of Faith was the major book that I had read through, and you said it's basically from 2016, so it's a decade old. Fantastic. And I want to thank you for coming on my show and talking to me about these things today.
Thank you for having me on, Brandon. I appreciate it. Thanks for sharing your thoughts and wisdom on these subjects and for covering them.
You take the blue pill, the story ends. You wake up in your bed and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill, you stay in Wonderland, and I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.
And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
It's a very strange, funny time where everybody would love to be able to be themselves, but they can't because they must fall in line with the person in front of them. The terrible thing about searching for the truth is that sometimes you find it.
You take the red pill. Remember, all I'm offering is the truth, nothing more. You stay in Wonderland. Believe whatever you want to believe.
See, the more at peace you become, the less you tolerate chaos. You stop explaining yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you.
You want to live that kind of life? I wish you the best. I'll be on the other side somewhere, you know?
Protecting your peace isn't about shutting the world out. It's about keeping your inner world clear enough to hear your own soul.
The truth, nothing more.